G'day everybody, Matt Ellis with you for the latest edition of the Cricket Library podcast, and a very special treat for us today. We sit down with award-winning cricket writer Malcolm Conn. He's been covering cricket for the last 40 years and he has seen it all, including probably the biggest story in world cricket, which he won a Walkley Award for in the 90s. He goes into great detail about what it was like sitting in the courtroom hearing evidence in Pakistan. He'll delve into Ashes tours, keeping relationships with the players, early memories of watching Shane Warne bowl in Sri Lanka, his debut test in Adelaide in 1985, and how things have changed in covering the game since then. There is plenty for us to discuss. So let's sit back, relax, and enjoy this conversation with Malcolm Conn. It's a very warm welcome to the Cricket Library podcast. Malcolm Conn, thanks so much for joining us.
Cheers, Matt. It's great to be there.
And years of working in and around cricket, Mal, and you'd have to have a love of the game to do that. Where did that passion for the game start for you?
Yeah, well, I guess it's one of those things that it's always been there. I mean, sort of growing up as I did in the sort of 60s and 70s, the kids in the street played cricket and the kids at school played cricket, and that's what just people did. You kicked the footy in the summer in the winter, and you played cricket in the summer, and it was just sort of always there. But the defining season was probably the 74-5 Ashes series in Australia, where Lillee and Thompson went mad, and Australia really did stitch up the Poms. And we had the Chappells and Marsh, and it was a very good side. Walters, Ross Edwards, and that sort of season really captured my imagination, and I was sort of absolutely hooked then. Sort of before that, I could sort of take it or leave it and just, played it at school or in the street or whatever. But if there was cricket on, from that moment on, I had to be thoroughly engaged, whether it was sort of on the telly or on the radio, or being able to, we lived in the country, so being able to get down and actually watch a day of Test cricket, which was a wonderful adventure. So, yeah, I've got very vivid memories of that era, and sort of moving on from there.
How far was the trip for you growing up in regional Victoria to get to a big game of cricket? What sort of exercise was it for you and the family to watch a day's play?
No, it wasn't too bad because I was originally born in Deniliquin in southern New South Wales, and did my early schooling there, but I did my sort of high schooling in South Gippsland at a place called Wonthaggi down near Phillip Island, where it was colder and wetter than Melbourne, if that's possible. And so it was only a sort of a couple of hours drive. But because we lived in the country, it was sort of such a big deal. So we didn't go down until Boxing Day 1975, when the West Indies played Australia in Melbourne, and there was a record first day crowd, I think of something like 85,000 people. And Thompson and Lillee were at their, not so much Lillee, I suppose he was always good, but Thompson was at his absolute dangerous, devilish peak. And so he took we were fortunate to watch them bowl on Boxing Day, and Thompson took the first 5 and Lillee got the next 4, and then Walker got the last 1. So, and then I think it was Turner and McCosker, I think, opened the batting in the last Redpath it was. I think it was Redpath.
Yep.
Opened the batting in the last half hour or so. So it was an amazing day, like the noise, the crowd chanting Tomo, like for someone who had never been to the MCG and never experienced more than just local bush sport, to actually sort of go to the MCG and be in a crowd like that, and then hear them roar when the wicket fell, and the crowd just chanting Tomo was just extraordinary. And one of the things I do remember is clearly a lot of people were listening to their ABC radios, because you could hear the owly pips going around the ground. from the ABC radio. In fact, there was an appeal at one stage if people could turn their radios down, which surprised me because I don't know how anyone with all those people and all that noise could have heard them. But anyway, it was a day that's sort of ingrained in my memory, and will be until the day I die, I reckon.
Yeah, absolutely. And Deniliquin, hometown of Simon O'Donnell as well.
Yes, yeah, that's right. Yep. Well, it's interesting. Even though I was born in and lived in the early years of my life in southern New South Wales, it all felt like Victoria because it was about 3 hours from Melbourne. In fact, the Victorian train line from Melbourne to Echuca ran over the Murray and went as far as Deniliquin for the big cattle yards up there. So even though it was New South Wales, it actually felt like Victoria. My first memory of actually going to watch any sort of sport was wandering down with a schoolmate to watch the Finley Cats going around playing Aussie rules. So there was always a much stronger connection to Melbourne than there was to Sydney, and that was obviously not only distance but also with the sport that was played.
Yeah, you're a passionate Richmond Tigers fan as well, is that right?
I am indeed, mate. Yes, we had a very good run, but it's amazing how quickly it all ends because either all our premiership players have now retired or left. We've got about 7 new draft choices coming in, so I've got a few hard years ahead of us, I think, before they can build up again.
Now, take us back to being at school and thinking about what you want to do professionally, career-wise. What was it that attracted you to journalism?
Well, it's interesting because my father had always been involved in the dairy industry one way or another, and I hadn't really thought about it, but I enjoyed English at school, and I always did quite well at English at school. So I actually, when Form 5, which is now Year 11, work experience came up, I asked if I could do work experience on the local newspaper, and they gave me the opportunity, and I think I was the only bloke sort of working on the journalistic side who was younger than about 60, and I was playing in the local footy league, and so I ended up sort of covering a bit of footy for them during that work experience, and they asked me if I could keep writing match reports for them every week after that. So I'd write weekly match reports. It was a bit embarrassing when you were playing in the game, but I was never good enough to put myself with the best players, although occasionally you'd go up for a mark and get on a whack on the back of the head and get to put that in your paper. And then the following year, they offered me a cadetship, which is newspaper equivalent of an apprenticeship. And so I did my HSC part-time and did journalism part-time and did better at journalism than my HSC, I have to say.
Yep.
Just sort of went from there. I spent 4 or 5 years on the local paper in South Gippsland and the South Gippsland Sentinel Times, and then which was partly owned by The Age, and so The Age were looking for a VFL writer in those days, so they approached our newspaper and just asked if they had anyone, and they nominated me, so I got an interview and got a job on The Age. And my early years, I worked on a number of different newspapers: The Age, The Australian, the now defunct Times on Sunday, the now merged Melbourne Sun. So I worked on 4 different papers in 5 years, essentially as a footy writer. But I moved papers to have more opportunities to write cricket, and ended up spending a long, probably 2 decades or more on The Australian, where I became chief cricket writer, because even though I love my footy, cricket was always my first love. And had a lot of great opportunities over a long period of time, covering Australia and overseas. So it's been a wonderful journey, I have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Take us back to your first Test match. I mean, we ask players on the podcast, they get their baggy green, they play for Australia. Even Pat Farhart recently, when he got the call up for his first Test match as physio, I would imagine for someone like yourself, the opportunity to go and cover a Test match for the first time would be a pretty big deal. Tell us what you remember about that Adelaide Test match, 1985, working on the big stage for the first time.
Well, it's interesting. So I started in Melbourne at the age in '84, and the '84-5 season I was on the age essentially as a VFL writer, and there was no room for me to write cricket. So then I moved to the Australian the following year, '85-6, and just started covering Sheffield Shield during the summer and doing VFL in the winter. And then after a few games, it turned out our chief cricket writer was, I don't know quite what had happened, but he wasn't available for that test.
Oh.
So they asked me to go and cover it. So I'd only done probably 3 Sheffield Shield matches at that stage, and was asked to go off and cover the test, and it was all a bit of a shock, really. So, but I loved my cricket, and I thought I knew everything about it, and as you do when you're that age, and so I packed up my old typewriter and off I went. And in those days in Adelaide, I don't think anything had changed since Bradman had played, because the press box was actually a series of trestles in the old wooden members stand, and so you'd fault your typewriter on that. You'd have to be careful. You'd have to put your notebook on top of your typewriter paper, because otherwise it would just blow away with the wind blowing through the members stand. Or you might have some kid wandering over and looking over your shoulder with eating ice cream or something. So it was all, and you were side on, which was rather than most media facilities. In fact, all media facilities these days are basically sort of wicket to wicket, but you were side on, so and they only had one television down on the bottom right-hand trestle, so you were sort of, every time something happened, you were sort of straining your neck to see what had actually happened. So, but yeah, look, I remember being quite comfortable. I'd actually covered a tour game there because I worked on the Australian. It was a national paper. I covered a tour game in Adelaide earlier that year, when I covered India playing South Australia, and I actually did an interview with Sonny Gavaskar. And so I sort of, because I'd followed cricket so closely, I felt comfortable with that. So, and you don't know what you don't know in those days. So I felt quite comfortable covering the test match, but it was a little bit sort of intimidating or overwhelming at times, where you in the old days, you'd go to the bar sort of either before the test started, in the evening, or after play, and usually there was sort of a stack of people in the team hotel bar, including players and journalists, and sometimes they spoke and sometimes they didn't, depending on how everyone had gone. But it was sort of quite intimidating, sort of mixing in social circles with people who were sort of, being your heroes. And didn't care much who you were or what you did. So it was, but yeah, I do have vivid memories of that too, sort of particularly sitting at the trestles with the typewriter. And
on that, Mal, with the typewriter, these days everyone's in the media box, they've got their laptops out. You can fire off stories as the game is going. 1985, what's the process of you coming up with the story and it ending up in the paper? How did that process work?
Well, you would write the story and then ring up a copy taker and then read the story down the phone to the copy taker. And there were times if things were sort of happening in a hurry, that you may have to sort of just do it off your notes. So I remember doing sort of, football games off my notes, particularly night games, because it was just so busy. So it was all very basic. You're just sort of basically explaining what's happening or how it's going.
Yeah.
But in those days, it's the deadlines on newspapers are a lot more relaxed. There's obviously no internet, so you're not racing to get stuff out. The first edition deadline, I think, was about 8 or 8:30 at night. So it's some sort of 6. You'd do a press conference afterwards. You'd probably sort of half written your story anyway.
Yeah.
So you're probably finished by 7:30 and read it through. So it's all very comfortable. Well, the world's a very different place now with the internet. It's sort of there are constant updates depending on what's happened, and then you sort of what we say file on the bell, which is more a reference to the footy game. But as soon as stumps comes, or covering a footy game, as soon as the siren goes, you've basically got to have your story ready to go. So the last thing you want is a close footy game, because you're writing about the result that you don't know, and then as soon as the siren goes, you're basically supposed to fill in the scores and hit the button. So you're barracking for 10-goal wins there, and so you can rather than last kick results. But cricket was always, and we ended up, it wasn't long after the typewriters, we ended up with the first basic computers. And so sort of I became a chief cricket writer in 92. So Robert Craddock, who writes for News Corp, and myself were both appointed as chief cricket writers for the 1992 World Cup in Australia and New Zealand. And then it was a really busy period, because we did the 92 World Cup, and then I did 92 Sri Lanka tour. Then we came home and did the Australian Summer 92 through West Indies. Then we went to New Zealand. Then we did the Ashes, and then we came home and did another home summer. And in those days, tours were a lot longer than they are now. So I think Sri Lanka wasn't too bad. I think we had about a month after Sri Lanka, which was about a 6-week tour, because you usually played a couple of tour games and sort of 3 tests or and some one-dayers or whatever. But then we went 92 through West Indies, straight to New Zealand for a tour. There was only about a 2 or 3 week gap between the end of the New Zealand tour and the beginning of the Ashes tour. And the Ashes tour went 18 weeks, and we played everyone. You name it, we played them. We played amateurs, we played minor counties, you name them, we played them. And played just about every county, if not every county, in one form or another. We'd done that New Zealand tour, which was about 6 weeks, and we'd played 3 tests and 5 one-day games. In the first 6 weeks of that Ashes tour, the only international cricket we'd played had been 3 one-day games.
Oh,
it was all county cricket or exhibition type matches. And that tour is really interesting, because we played so many games. Like the early test, there were 2 county games between each test, and the later ones there was 1. But Matthew Hayden scored 1,000 first-class runs on that tour without ever playing a test match. So it gives you an idea of how much cricket we played, and how that will be a record that will never be broken by an Australian.
Yeah, that's incredible numbers, isn't it? Because that was when he and Michael Slater were sort of dueling for that.
That's right.
Opening batting spot.
Yeah, well, Hayden was the sort of anointed child, I suppose you'd say, and he played in the one-dayers, but he struggled. They tied him up sort of bowling into his into his body a bit. And then Michael Slater sort of had real dancing feet, and he was just batting magnificently in county matches. So he just got the nod ahead of Hayden on form. Well, that's never going to happen again, because you turn up. It's rare that you play any warm-up games at all, and so they just take the team from the previous test, basically, or make changes out of what happened in the previous test, rather than guys performing on tour.
Can you take me back to Sri Lanka? I'm really interested in your thoughts around Shane Warne at that time, because he'd played the Sydney Test match, and Shastri had batted beautifully against him there. And I think it was that Sri Lanka tour where we started to get a glimmer of what we had with Shane Warne. What were your recollections of his bowling on that tour?
Well, I remember the first test in Colombo, and it was incredibly hot and humid. I'd never experienced anything like it. And the wicket was surprisingly damp. And so the seamers, I think it might have been Champaka Ramanaika, but I think. But anyway, the no-name Sri Lankan seamers actually created a bit of a few problems, and knocked the Australians over. And then the Sri Lankans made an absolute stack. And in fact, Ranatunga declared late on must have been the 3rd day, I think. And him and when Kalaratana was absolutely flying, he just smashed them everywhere. He had the destructive touch I don't think I've ever seen. And Warne at that stage had something like at the end of Sri Lanka's first innings, he'd played 2.5 Test matches and had something like 1 for 335. And you just thought, gee whiz, is this bloke, ever going to really, you just wondered how he was going to go. And but Australia batted well in their second innings and down the sort of right through the order and got a lead of, I think it was 176, but it was sort of, and Sri Lanka were going quite well. They were going okay, but Arjuna Ranatunga decided he was going to get it all in about 1 over. And he was just sort of, playing like Constance, I suppose, in Melbourne. Well, not quite, but similar. And he danced down the wicket to McDermott and tried to hit him back over his head. And Border, I reckon, was at mid-on and ran back about halfway to the boundary, threw his hat off and sort of dived and took the catch. And Sri Lanka just collapsed. But it was still in the balance because it was so hot the players were cooked. Greg Matthews had an excellent test with bat and ball and was bowling really well at one end. And with only, there must have been only 15 or 20 runs to get at the end, they brought Warne back. And the tail enders were obviously sort of pretty, lower order were obviously pretty nervous about and so they decided to go after Warne. But as we know, when Warne gets it right, his dip and drift really does create problems. So he ended up getting 3 for 1 and bowling Australia to victory. So it was then we thought this guy's got something special about him to come on in those circumstances. I mean, he could have been slogged. Australia could have lost. No one would have really thought about it. Just this kid, this hopeful spinner got slogged like everyone else. But no, it was that moment I just remember. And Greg Matthews told him, spin the cover off it. It doesn't matter if it bounces twice, just spin the cover off it. And he did. And, and it's sort of, then I think he played the second test, got a foot injury, didn't play the third. Pretty sure both the second and third tests might have been badly rain affected, I think.
Yep.
Which wasn't unusual for that time of year. I mean, Sri Lanka has 2 monsoons at various times of the year, so it can be difficult to actually find the spot between the two of them. Yeah.
And you don't, like in your profession, it's great to be acknowledged when you do good work. It can be few and far between. You're just sort of toiling away, doing your job. But a Walkley Award for your story on the match fixing. Give us a little bit of a background around that whole Pakistan scenario and the match fixing, or not match, like the bookmakers, and what did it mean to you to be acknowledged with an award?
Well, it's got an interesting background. There's been mumbling of match fixing, but it was always considered to be, on the subcontinent, and Australia wasn't affected, and then the story broke in 1994. Sorry, maybe it was 95. It must have been of the Australia's 94 tour of Pakistan, which was Mark Taylor's first test as captain, where Tim May and Shane Warne had been offered something like $200,000 US to bowl badly on the last day of a test match that was in the balance. And then Mark Waugh was offered $200,000 to throw his wicket away in a one-day game because he was, at that stage, opening the batting for Australia in one-day cricket and going well. And that was that broke, I think, early 95. And then I covered tours of India and Pakistan in 98. Pakistan was about August, September from memory, September, October it might have been. It could have been August, September, October in those days. And there were match-fixing hearings going on at the Lahore High Court where it was like a royal commission. So they were bringing officials and players before the judge at the High Court and questioning them. And so myself and Mark Ray, who was working for The Age at the time, I was working at the Australian. We went to Lahore. In fact, we went twice to cover the match fixing hearings at various stages. And remember Wazim Akram being on the stand, Wakar units, and they were just questioning all the players. What do you know about it? And it was quite sort of surreal. Like the courtroom the court was this massive building, had more than one courtroom in it. It had this massive old, big red brick colonial building, built in about 1868 or something. Mm. And in this sort of old, classically built courtroom, the judge was sitting. It was almost like up high on a throne. It was almost like you were sort of ruling over his domain. So, and he was a big fella in a black coat, or the long flowing coats dresses that they wear.
Yeah. Like a robe.
Like a robe. That's it. Thank you. And so that the hearings would be in Urdu, and then you'd get a brief summary in English. And so we were standing up the back because there was a speaker up the back in English where you could hear the English summary. So Pakistan is clearly a far more eloquent language than English, because they could talk for 10 minutes and get a 30-second summary of what had actually happened. Or 15 minutes it might have been. Every 15 minutes we got a summary.
Yeah.
And Wazim Akram was up sort of giving evidence, and yes, he's heard about it, but he hasn't experienced it. And that was the same story for every player that went up. Yes, we've heard about it, but we haven't experienced it. And there was all these people with pens and paper sort of standing around the dock area where Wazim Akram was giving evidence. And I thought, geez, they let the media close here, because the courts that I'd covered, you're sitting back in a bench sort of off the side. And so anyway, he finishes giving evidence and walks off, and lets people just mob him and get autographs from him in the middle of the Lahore High Court. So there was a bit of that. So anyway, the second time we went back, Inzamam ul-Haq was called, and there was a tour of New Zealand where Wazim was captain, which was supposed to be dodgy, and one of the fast bowlers, a young bloke whose name eludes me, had given evidence, being told by Wazim to bowl down the leg side or whatever, and the poor kid obviously got heavied and changed his story and got busted for perjury later on. But so Inzamam's giving evidence, and it's all happening in Urdu, and he's not saying very much, and his voice is getting quieter and quieter and quieter. And all of a sudden the judge is blowing up, and he said, "What do you mean you can't remember swearing on the Quran? Give me one good reason why I shouldn't put this man away. Take him away and bring him back tomorrow." I thought, oh, crikey, that's happened.
Wow.
So apparently all the players had been made to swear on the Quran that they hadn't done any, hadn't been involved in match fixing. But clearly, Inzi's story, because I don't think he was the brightest tool in the case. He apparently he'd be just saying, "I can't remember to everything." And once it got to the Quran and he couldn't remember swearing on the Quran, the judge just lost it. So Anyway, he must have got some good coaching overnight, because he came back the next day and the judge was satisfied, so he didn't go to jail.
Wow.
But there was a fair bit of angst going around about that, and there was some really interesting stuff that sort of came out of it, about accusations of people getting vast amounts of money in those days, like Mushtaq Ahmed, the leg spinner, who went on to become spin coach for England, was accused, or this bloke who claimed he was a bookmaker claimed he gave him $200,000 US. So,
oh wow,
there was. And Salam Malika obviously got banned for the captain. In fact, talking match fixing, if we fast forward to Hansi Cronje, and we're in South Africa in 2000, and I covered there was a one-day series, I think April 2000, three-match one-day series between Australia and South Africa, and that's where it all came out. And then we went back later to cover the hearing, and Pat Simcox was giving evidence, and Hansi Cronje had approached him and said that we've been offered $200,000 to throw the match, which would have been, 200,000 divided by 11 players, I suppose, or whoever it was.
Yeah.
And he went and asked Pat Simcox about it. And this is Pat Simcox giving evidence. He's also covering the trial for the local sports networks. That was quite hilarious. But
bit like your old footy days, Mal.
Yeah, that's right. So Pat Simcox has given evidence that he told Cronje that, no, knock it back because that's not the way we play the cricket and our cricket, and it's not enough. So you can make that what you will.
Oh, gee.
And apparently Cronje actually put it to a team meeting around that time that did they want to take the money? And there was all sorts of stories have come out around that. So
was part of the rationale for that, I'm just trying to get my I'm not sure I've got this right in my mind, but was part of the rationale that the heavy schedule of players feeling like they're meaningless one-day games anyway, like, is that where the door got pulled ajar where they would actually consider something like that?
Or with the subcontinent, the players were generally very poorly paid. The good players would get endorsements from major corporations and they'd be looked after, and that's fine. But in terms of being paid from the cricket board, they were very poorly paid, really.
Mm.
And cricketers generally were in those days, going back, sort of 25 or 30 years ago, were poorly paid. So these guys could make more by taking one decent bribe than they could for the whole of their careers in some cases. So the temptation was enormous. And if you look through the World Transparency Index, where some of these places sit on the World Transparency Index, then you'll get to understand why it looked even more attractive. So, and it's interesting that Cronje's teammates said after he got busted that, and there's an aside to that too, that Cronje was named. He was caught on phone taps by police. I think it was the Mumbai CIB or whoever they were, caught him on phone taps talking to bookmakers because they were chasing these bookmakers, and they got Cronje. And so when it all, and he eventually fessed up. He fessed up while we were in South Africa during that one-day series, and Sean Pollock took over as captain. And if he'd never fessed up, if he just denied it and said, "Oh, it's rubbish," I reckon he would have been all right, because even though the Mumbai police or the CIB, whoever they were, released transcripts, there was no. The tapes were never released, so no one actually ever heard the tapes. So if he just kept claiming he was innocent and said, well, where have these transcripts come from? Give me the originals where these transcripts have come from. Where are the tapes? And if it was a cricket hearing, would the CIB in India have released the tapes for a cricket hearing? They certainly didn't release them for the hearing involving Cronje in South Africa that I covered in 2000. So, but that's an aside. I mean, Cronje fessed up.
Yeah.
And then he made admissions to taking money from various places, at various times, and also getting a couple of other players involved as well. But his teammates that we spoke to afterwards, none of them went into bat for him. They all said, they all talked about how much he loved money. There was one, like apparently there was, he had, numerous bank accounts in England, and they were finding money in shoeboxes in his house, and, it was just bizarre. But one of the players, might have been a couple of the players, told this story about how they got this bonus or something from somewhere. And, the standard thing is just share it with the team. And Hansi said, I'm keeping half of this and you guys can have the rest.
Yeah, right.
Uh, so, yeah, and he was paid R1 million, which at that stage was probably, I think it was 4 to 1, quarter of a million Australian dollars, I think, when he went down in 2000.
Yep.
Um, the person I felt most sorry for was his father. I met his father and spent some time talking to him. He was involved in local cricket in the Free State at Bloemfontein, and he was a lovely guy. He was the world's loveliest, most gentle bloke,
Mm.
and he turned up to every day of the Cronje hearing. And I just felt so sorry for him.
Oh, yeah, incredible. As a parent, something like that would be a massive ordeal to see your son going through something like that, and
Yeah.
the consequences, the natural consequences of decisions he's made. So,
Yeah.
Anyway,
sorry, getting back to the original question with Warne on War. Sorry, we on that Pakistan tour in '98. I got to know the sort of the legal aides who were helping with the Pakistan Cricket Board with the inquiry, and one young bloke showed me a letter, and he folded over the top and the bottom. And the letter said that Mark Waugh was involved with the same bookmaker as Salim Malik. And I thought, really? So I looked through, and I remember sitting down and going through all his scores on the subcontinent, and he had a terrific record on the subcontinent, because in those days the wickets were quite flat, and they still are flat for obviously T20s and one-dayers mostly. And he had a terrific record. And I thought, I can't see any pattern here where he's throwing matches. It just doesn't make any sense, you know. And then, so at the start of the 98-99 season, when England was coming, Cricket Australia decided to have a big launch in Brisbane, big black tie launch, and quite a few of us ended up back at a nightclub that Ian Healy had an interest in called Adrenaline, and it was, you know, late at night, and I was just talking to someone who was sort of, you know, tangentially involved in and around it, well, sort of more of around the team, I suppose.
Yep.
They were around, so they had a feel for things, and I just remember talking about this and being frustrated about this whole match fixing thing and what was going on, and he said, "Oh yeah," he said, "Yeah, Junior got busted for that." And I said, "What?" And I remember it was late at night. I remember I'd been told other things late at night in various places like this and forgotten them. So I ran over to the bar, grabbed half a dozen coasters and the barman's pen, and stood in this dark corner of this bloke and started writing things down on the back of coasters and putting them in my shirt pocket. And basically, the basic story was, that it wasn't for match fixing. It was for cooperating with bookmakers selling information. And I said, "You sure?" I said, "Yeah." So I, during that summer, or the start of that summer, I was desperately trying to find out what was going on, and couldn't nail it down. I'd been told this, and it sounded, it all sounded quite plausible. And no one actually that I spoke to, players and officials or whatever, would actually agree or confirm it.
Yeah.
So anyway, I got together as much as I could, and I went to Malcolm Speed, who was the CEO at Cricket Australia, and I put a dozen questions to him, and he just said a straight no comment to every question. And I thought, I've got something here. But he's a barrister, and he knows that I haven't got enough to print. So anyway, I ended up I got something from somewhere that confirmed it. And I rang the paper up and said, "Okay, we're going to run this." And I told them what had happened. And of course, they couldn't believe it. I went, "Really?" Oh, sorry, no, that's right. I went back to Speed, and I said, "Look, I've got enough to run with, so you can either make a comment or I can say that you said no comment, but we're going to run this on the front page tomorrow. And he said, give me an hour. And he rang me back in an hour and I said, right, what do you know? And I told him and he said, oh, that's not much, is it? And I said, it's enough. And so he told me the background of it and he said, oh, Mark Warne was also involved as well. I had no idea about Mark Warne.
Shane Warne or?
Oh, no, Shane Warne. Sorry, I knew about Mark Warne. I had no idea about Shane Warne. Sorry.
Yeah.
So I had no idea about Shane Warne. I thought, oh, really? And so he told me everything that had happened. So I wrote it, and we have this great picture on the paper of the media manager at cricket because it was just before it was going into the Adelaide Test match, and so Mark Warne had just landed in Adelaide. Oh, I tell you, one of the things that helped was I rang up Mark Warne and I said, I've been told this, and I'm going to write it. And he said, who told you that? Oh, you can't say, can you? I said, no. And then he said, and he didn't sort of basically say anything else.
Yeah, right.
And so he didn't actually, I think he was so much on the back foot, he didn't actually deny it.
Yeah.
Which was sort of all part of the puzzle. So there's this picture that we ran on the front page of the paper of Mark Warne putting his hand on his head after arriving in Adelaide to be told by the Cricket Australia media manager that this story was going to be in tomorrow's newspaper. So, it was quite an ordeal, and it was quite an interesting time in cricket, unfortunately.
Yeah, and good segue into where I want to go now around building trust with players and keeping good relationships. When you've got to break some news that's not going to be popular with the player that you're writing about, like that was a big one, but like simple things like players out of form, possible players that should be in the team instead of someone else. You've got an opinion on all those things. You're paid to share your opinions, but you also need to have the relationships with the players to write good stories as well. How did you go about building trust and keeping good relationships?
Oh, it varied obviously from player to player and from circumstance to circumstances. I mean, I used to be quite sort of strong and straightforward about the way I approached it, and sort of in hindsight, you've got to think that, well, these are young guys trying to make it in a cutthroat international sport, and that's their whole life. And, of course, they're going to be sensitive to anything that you say. Now, players are a lot more media savvy now than they used to be, although having said that, there's not the same sort of closeness of connection that you could develop that we used to be able to develop with players, because we'd stay in the same hotel as the players in those days. So you'd go down to breakfast, and if they'd had a bad day, everyone had their head down, or if you'd given someone a pull through because of the way they'd been playing, then they'd sort of be looking away or whatever the case may be. Or so there was always a bit of standoffishness in terms of and you did over the journey, you did get to know some players pretty well, particularly if you'd been around for a while, and they sort of came to accept that you didn't stitch them up, that if you had a bad day, you had a bad day, and probably it's best if I don't read the paper. I mean, I used to tell players, mate, it's a numbers game. If you don't get the numbers, you don't get a game. And over time you sort of develop some relationships, and I was fortunate enough to develop some quite decent relationships, and it's not easy. Like if players are going through tough times or whatever the case may be, but the senior players have been around the block and who know you, and they know that they live and die on their performances. But yeah, look, it's certainly very intimidating when I started, and as I said, going down to breakfast or going down to the hotel bar afterwards, and most people ignoring you. So it's not like you're on a constant touring holiday watching the cricket and having a beer with the players afterwards. It doesn't work that way. It's a pretty tense and difficult relationship a lot of the time.
Yeah, and on the other side of things, you talk about reporting on the match fixing kind of stuff as a journalist. Probably the biggest story since then was Australia in South Africa, and the ball tampering. You're there at the press conference with Stephen Smith and David Warne back in Australia when they come back after all had transpired there. What's it like managing a crisis-like situation as the media person helping the players through that kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, given the profile of those players and the support they had around them with their manager and their manager get various other people on board, there wasn't a lot. While I did spend a bit of time with them, there wasn't a lot that I could do apart from reinforce the basics of just tell it straight, just get it over and done with. Just to basically just got to do it tough and get it out of the way and then move on. Because if you aren't seen to be fronting up and taking the hard questions and sort of being contrite and apologetic, then it's just going to drag on. So as difficult as it is, you've just got to front it. And that was what happened with both of them. That they just got there and they fronted it. Now, to this day, there's still questions hanging over what may or may not have happened and who knew what. But sort of everyone's got on with it. The Warne and Smith and Bancroft obviously got suspended for significant amounts of time. So it was a very harsh punishment. And the punishment wasn't, in terms of Smith, who was captain, and Warne, who was vice captain, it wasn't just about the ball tampering as an isolated incident. It was about the fact that the behaviour of the Australian team at that stage had become quite poor. And that test series in South Africa was just dreadful in terms of the way the players behaved. And there'd been a sort of an MOU, a sort of a dispute between the players and the administrators a year before that, about a new memorandum of understanding in terms of payment and how it was all going to be done. And the administration sort of tried to make significant changes the players didn't like. And in the end, the players held firm and got what they wanted. And it was a pretty ugly sort of a time, I've got to say. It was a very unpleasant time, really, and totally unnecessary. I thought the Cricket Australia handled the whole thing very badly. So I think there was a feeling there was a sort of a mistrust or a resentment of the administration, and they weren't going to be told what to do. So every time James Sutherland rang up and told them to put their heads in, they didn't listen. And it just got to the point where it got out of hand. And so when the ball tampering thing came up, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. And I've got to say there's a significant difference between the time sort of before and after Sandpapergate in terms of the behaviour of the players. Now, clearly Pat Cummins has helped that too, because he's such a sort of a cool, calm, collected sort of guy, and he doesn't believe in playing cricket in that way. Doesn't mean he's not ruthless. If you're down the other end and he's bowling to you, then you know how ruthless he can be. But in terms of his behaviour, he's very strong on playing cricket in the right way. And I've got to say that for someone who's watched a lot of Test cricket, I enjoy watching cricket a lot more now than I did when some of the guys were carrying on like brats.
And on reflection, Mal, you 40 years since your first Test match. Tell us about life now. What's the next stage of life looking like for Malcolm Conn?
Yeah, it's an interesting. I'm sort of in a bit of a twilight zone at the moment. The Sydney Morning Herald, where I sort of because I've been involved in with Cricket Australia and Cricket New South Wales for sort of 7 years in that joint communications role from 2014 to 2021, and it was a COVID era, and there were significant changes between, particularly Cricket Australia, and I was offered the opportunity to go back into newspapers. So yeah, I took it, and spent 3.5 years at the Herald, and the Herald was sort of downsizing. Well, the whole Channel 9 was downsizing with voluntary redundancies. There was sort of something like 200 across the organisation, including 85 in the print division, and I sort of thought, well, it's probably actually a good time to take a bit of a runway and see what else is out there. So I took voluntary redundancy, and I've been doing a mixture of involved in sort of a documentary, doing quite a bit of research and background work on some documentaries over the last year or so, and I've been writing a couple of pieces a week for the sporting website The Raw, which I've been quite enjoying to get my hand in, and doing other bits and pieces with agency work or magazine work as required. So I keep thinking I've got to get a real job again one day sometime soon, but things are going okay at the moment.
Enjoying it while it's lasting.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. You can have your 2-hour coffees and no one's looking over your shoulder.
Now, before we go, Mal, our final question is around a dream cricket net session. If you could host a dream cricket net session, you can invite 3 people that you want. They don't have to be cricketers. They could be anyone you want. Who are on your invitation list?
So they don't have to be involved in cricket at all. They can be anyone.
Could be anyone. It's we've had, I think Nathan Horwitz, he chose The Rock. I think Peter George wanted Johnny Howard there.
Yes.
There's been a few other movie stars, actors. Michael Jordan gets quite a few mentions as well. But then there's the obvious sort of cricket nuffy sort of Bradman, Muralitharan, Warne kind of contingent out there as well. So totally up to you. Yep. Free choice, open slather. Who do you reckon you'd invite?
Well, I'd invite Barack Obama because I was always a great admirer of his as a statesman and as an orator. It's remarkable to think the ups and downs that the United States has had when they had him as president. But he was really, really fascinating. I'd invite Neil Armstrong as the first man on the moon because that to me was, I can just remember sitting cross-legged on the floor of the hall at Finley Primary School, and they wheeled out this little black and white television and in front of the whole school, and we watched Neil Armstrong walk on the moon. That always captured me.
Yeah.
And I'd also love to invite Sir Garfield Sobers because I never got to meet him, and everyone who saw him play said he was supposed to be the most brilliant player that's ever played Test cricket. So I'd love to have the opportunity to meet him and spend some time with him.
Sobers, Armstrong, and Obama. What a combo! Yep. And you teach him a little bit about cricket, you reckon?
Yeah. I'd love to have played a game of cricket on the moon. That would have been interesting.
Well, thank you so much, Mal. I've really enjoyed chatting with you, hearing more of your story, more of the ins and outs of life covering cricket, and wish you all the best with the next phase with what you're doing. And really appreciate you sharing with our listeners on the Cricket Library podcast.
Been an absolute pleasure, Matty. Thanks for having me.
A massive thanks to Malcolm Conn for joining us on this edition of the Cricket Library podcast, and a massive thanks to you, our loyal listeners who tune in to each and every episode, and a very warm welcome to all of our new listeners who have tuned in for the first time. It's been wonderful having your company, and we look forward to you engaging with us on social media. We're on all the major platforms, and of course, thecricketlibrary.com is where you can stay up to date with what is on the horizon for the Cricket Library podcast. Plenty coming up in 2025, which we're looking forward to bringing you, that's for sure. It's time to say goodbye. This has been Matt Ellis for the Cricket Library podcast. Bye for now.